Welcome to Late Start Advantage, where I speak with professionals who pivoted later in their careers and went on to become successful founders and business owners, proving it's never too late to start something meaningful. I'm Jacques Valencia, and today I'm joined by Colin Jowell, founder of BillWill and co-founder of UDKU. You don't know us, an innovation and customer strategy consultancy that was later acquired by KPMG in 2018. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Colin, you founded UDKU and eventually sold it to KPMG. But before all that, was there a moment where you genuinely thought this might not work?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are many different ways to start a business, particularly a consulting business like that. The one that I'd probably say is highly advisable is starting with an actual client, which we didn't do. We jumped and waited for the net to appear. So there were definitely several moments in the early days when me and my partners really sort of, I think day one was probably the most hilarious, where we sort of got into the office and looked at each other and went, all right, we're going to go for lunch because we've got nothing to do. And then, of course, you sort of get into a rhythm of what it's going to take to kind of grow and develop the business. But certainly there was a cold realization, particularly in the early days, where we're going, other people generally have a little bit more of this stuff sorted before they say they're going to do these things. But, you can definitely plan too much for things. I don't think we were at risk of making that mistake. We certainly didn't plan for that. And then along the way, you start a business with a desire to deliver a certain kind of product and deliver a certain kind of service. But you do have to make many pragmatic decisions as you go in order to take on the work that's available and the opportunities that presented themselves. And I think the challenges then became sort of staying true to that vision and making sure that the opportunities that we were chasing and pursuing were ones that aligned to it. And then you get the ultimate sort of growing pain, which is, you've begun to have some success and some reputation in the markets. And then it's about, you hired people and you need to sustain those people. And you've taken, people have put their lives and their careers in your hands. And that's a huge responsibility, and one that used to keep me up at night a lot. So I think when you're in business for yourself, you just learn to deal with the fact that it's a different kind of pressure and a different kind of stress. And you just kind of hopefully get a little bit better at dealing with it over time.
And you're mentioning about starting without an actual client. How did you get your first client?
I had two amazing business partners. All three of us were very experienced in the field and had a number of clients and contacts from previous worlds. No designated clients, but a pretty strong network. That was definitely helpful. Every time I've gone out and done a business, I've really been able to go back to that network, and whether it's people that you know directly or the people that they know that are willing to help out, that network will power you through no matter how many pivots you take. Because ultimately, if you have a strong network of people for whom you have done good work for in the past and have been a good human for in the past, people tend to take the call. So I've always been pretty lucky as far as that's concerned. And certainly my partners did as well. We sort of pulled together the various communications and networks that we had. And then slowly someone starts giving you a little project here or a little project there, and then it begins to grow into something bigger.
And how old were you when you started UDKU?
2030. I would have been 38. Sorry, I had to do some math there. 38 was, pushing 40. I think now that I mention it, that's kind of interesting. The last pivot was at 48. So clearly I have a sort of a 2 years to the end of the decade thing. I really hope this is the last one.
It's a pattern.
There's definitely a pattern of some form of, I don't know how, if you're astrological and you think your Saturn is returning or whatever. For me, it's definitely 2 years up to the decade. I'm going, okay, well, how does the next, how have I spent the last decade and how do I want to spend the next one, I guess. So yeah, it was 38. So the first one wasn't the youngest, I suppose. There definitely are people who, particularly in the tech space, start much younger than I did. I like to refer to it, I was very much attached to the heroin drip of a salary right up until that point. But at a certain point, the forces aligned. I wouldn't say the stars aligned, because I do feel you kind of get pushed into these things. It's less about blinding vision and sometimes just a confluence of circumstances that goes, okay, now's the time.
And you mentioned about your network, which is your saving grace, and that's where you got your first clients. How did you create that network?
I was very fortunate to work in some fairly big companies. I think that's definitely a fantastic starting ground. My first client when I moved to Australia back in 2007 was Optus, and Optus was like the Air Force of marketing, if you like. There were so many great people, a huge marketing team, very talented people, all of whom have gone on to do amazing things. And, big clients like that, big agency work like that, people all go into different directions. Back then, as a new immigrant to the country, working for a big company with a big brand, with big brands, and meeting lots and lots of people through that was invaluable. And then it's really about what you do when you're in that job. I always feel I got way too much credit in the early days in working that account because I was brought into work on the account. And one of the first things I did is I had a team of 30 marketers on the other side that I'd never met. So I started putting together a weekly newsletter of everything that I found in the telco world that was interesting. I didn't really know that anyone was reading it until I skipped a week. And everyone's like, where's the telco news? And it's just about, doing the things that you aren't necessarily asked for, not just being totally responsive in the job and just sort of finding a way to go. There's always a way to go and be above and beyond for people. And if you constantly adopt that kind of mindset of what else can I do to be helpful, useful, and it's with that kind of sort of, I suppose, generosity of being useful, I suppose is the way I try to think about it. That kind of thing cements your reputation, really sort of positions you as somebody that people can ask to help them with difficult things. And when you're in that privileged position, then you have clients and friends, to be honest, for life,
And when you were doing this weekly newsletter, where were you working at?
I was working at an agency called M&C Saatchi, and particularly at the time, it was a very exciting place with hundreds of people and big accounts and big budgets. Back in the day when TV ads mattered, we're talking 20 odd years ago now, it was a very exciting time because advertising was, I think, a very different place. And I wouldn't necessarily say it was a simpler time. I don't think it was a simpler time, but it was definitely a lot of fun.
What's a common assumption organizations make about their customers that doesn't always hold up?
I think one of the areas that is, I suppose, the lifeblood of all business and marketing from a perspective is research. And research is an incredibly valuable tool, and evidence is an incredibly valuable tool. But I think the thing that I've learned as I've gone particularly into this business as well, and this is sort of a thematic from then and right up until now, is the potential pitfalls of what people tell you versus what they do. And I think that's sort of one of the sort of fundamental differences between a pivot in marketing to a difference in behavioral science, which is really where I'm at now, which is really focusing on the actions that people have versus the things that they say. And this is not to denigrate market research at all. On the contrary, I worked with some fantastic researchers. And the reason that makes them fantastic is they're very aware of the delta between what a customer says they want and what a customer says they'll do and what they do. And to be honest, it was a bit of a pitfall in terms of the early stages of starting BillWill, where I'd researched the concept with 1,000 Australians who said that they wanted it in its current form and that they'd be prepared to pay, upwards of $10 a month for it. Well, when I launched the product, none of those things proved to be true at all. And there was a huge, huge difference. But actually, your question was sort of way, way further back. I think that's actually been true a lot of the time. I even think of some of the telco campaigns that we did. Some of the most effective ones were the ones where we did something that we just knew to be true, even though the research didn't necessarily indicate that was 100% the right answer. So the famous campaign that we actually won an award for, where a lot of the research said, don't compare to your competition because it makes you look small and, you should really be standing up on your own 2 feet. But we did a launch for a phone plan and it didn't do what we needed it to do. And so we did a very cheeky, very brave campaign that flew pretty close to the wire in terms of comparative advertising regulation. It's very clear what we were doing, very clear what we were saying. And it worked its socks off and actually got us an effectiveness award. And it was a classic case example of not doing what either the research or the common wisdom said. And yeah, it was cheeky. It was a lot of fun. But what was great about it was really thrifty as well. Because it was take two on the campaign, we didn't have massive budgets on this one. We just had to pull something out of the bag. And the creative team did an incredible job and found some stock footage of, I think it was monkeys, because it was Optus at the time. And it was pretty amazing. So yeah, it's about being able to make some informed choices that aren't necessarily what they're playing back to you in the moment. So yeah, I think that's definitely a common thematic and one that I have to remind myself even now.
So you mentioned that the lifeblood is research and evidence, but you tried to go against the grain of the research and evidence, and because you did that, you get rewarded for it. How would you know which ones to go against the grain and which ones to go with the grain? Is it just experience? Is it just like feeling?
It's interesting how much more experience you get, how much better your intuition becomes, right? I think a solid gut instinct is something that you need to listen to, because that gut is often informed by a lot of evidence points, and even if you can't necessarily understand them. But I think there's a different logic that needs to sort of apply, which is, and it's certainly one that's standing in good stead now. You can spend a lot of time trying to assess and weigh up choices and decide what might work and what might not work. And now I'm much more a favor of trying to get things into market as quickly as possible and being, and it's that cliche of fail fast and break things. And what it really means is get things into the hands of people that can use and touch and feel the product as quickly as possible, because only through judging their behavior will you really be able to get a view on what's working and what's not. And so it's less about saying, well, using your intuition to pick, and more about saying, well, using your thriftiness to try and get things happening as quickly as possible, and then getting the feedback that you need, the evidence from reality rather than from a reported future state that we know as human beings we're pretty rubbish at predicting anyway. So
yeah, that is true. There's a lot of examples where people that do stocks, they always miss.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the hindsight bias that we carry is pretty extreme. If we were right, we tell everybody about it. And if we were wrong, we quietly hope that no one will notice and only pay attention to the things we were right about. But yeah, there are lots of things over the course of the last couple of years, especially, where I've been just dead wrong. And, and I enjoy being wrong, because that's one less thing I have to keep trying to do. So,
you mentioned thriftiness. Can you elaborate on that word?
If you're starting a business in Australia, and that's the audience that you're talking to, that's the kind of thing that they're interested in. We have a very small market, and yes, with digital businesses, the global market is there. But you're going to want to prove your concept in a small market that's got lower access to capital, that's got a lower appetite, to be honest, for risk, really. We certainly didn't start BillWill with masses and masses of cash. Even now, I wish I'd spent it more thriftily than we did. And because things just take longer than you expect them to. And, if you run on the assumption that no matter how passionately you believe in your particular concept, your first version is probably not going to be right, you really want to be saving as much resource for version 2 and version 3 and version 4 and version 5, and assume that it's going to get to that amount of versioning before you even begin to get it. Some people, and we see these examples, they work up out of bed, they've shot an Instagram advert and the next day they had a business, and I'm very pleased for them. That's certainly not been my experience. And I don't think that that's the majority of people's experiences. You hear about those massive successes because they are outliers, and yet we pay attention to them as if they're the norm, and they're not.
Yeah, they're more the exception than the rule.
Absolutely.
But then because they create a lot of hype, then it feels like, oh, if I'm not doing that, then I'm doing it wrong.
Correct. Absolutely. And most of the founders that I talk to, there's a sort of a general acceptance that if you can see 6 months ahead, you're doing well. For the ones that I sort of spend time, crying into beers and cups of tea with, most of us, operating in a place of deep uncertainty, really. To tie it back to your question, there's so much you don't know and is unknowable when you start something that thrift is a vital discipline, because you will need more resources and more time than you anticipate. And so, yeah, whoever said you've got to spend money to make money needs to be held accountable for the terrible decisions that I think they've enabled people to make. That's not a strategy to run a business. Yes, of course, you need to invest wisely, but you need to invest with as much enthusiastic passion that this is absolutely going to work, but with the absolute anticipation that maybe not quite as you expected.
I guess everyday people can relate to that. For example, they see someone that's doing photography and they're like, I want to get into photography. And so they buy the most expensive things,
yes,
not knowing if they're going to be interested to continue photography at all, rather than just, I have a phone, let's start with the phone.
Exactly. Someone was asking me some advice on a sort of a marketplace business idea, wanting to brief developers and all of this stuff. Try it through a Facebook group first. See if you can get it working as a Facebook group, because if you can't get it working within 10 people on Facebook, building the fanciest platform in the world ain't going to solve your problem. Now I do think about what is the most effective way of spending every single dollar. I've certainly, even in the BillWill journey, done some things where I was like, it was probably a little bit more optimistic in terms of what I thought the return would be than it should have been.
So I just want to go back a bit. You mentioned about you need to be aware of the delta that says what the customer wants versus what they actually do.
Yep.
Is there another variable to that delta, or is that the delta?
There's two gaps that you need to mind: what people say and what people do. And the one that behavioral scientists spend a lot of time thinking about, which is intention versus action. And they're similar. But the first is around the difference between what those people say they want versus what they end up doing. It can be pretty immense. I was talking, because of where I'm at in the funeral space, I speak to people in the funerals businesses a fair amount. And we were talking about the differences between cost and convenience as a means of choosing a funeral. I talk about some fun stuff these days, man. But, cost was coming out as the bigger factor. And I challenged that research because I don't know what person is going to say, I chose the most convenient solution for my loved one. I think cost is more socially acceptable as a reason for making a choice than I chose the easiest path for me at the time. That's a really classic example that's sort of fresh in my mind at the moment of what someone says is driving that decision versus what's actually driving that decision. Like, is someone going to say to you, when it came time to do this, I went to the first thing on Google, or they're going to try and find a better reason? And they'll always try and find a better reason.
So based on your experience so far, what's the best way to bridge that gap?
Get things into market quickly and learn from what people do. And, the minimum viable product mindset is probably something I've really only learned on this final round of a business. And I'll tell you why. The businesses that I started before were people's businesses, right? It's pretty easy to start a consulting style of business. You put up a sign, you change your LinkedIn profile, you get onto WordPress and off you go, and then you hustle. Stage 2 is always, and then you hustle. But stage 1, in terms of sort of building the product, is really the investment required was significantly lower. Particularly now, you don't really need to hire a whole bunch of people. Me and Claude do a huge amount of time on the side, and you don't need necessarily a huge amount of physical space or an office. But when you're building products, the temptation to build in the perfect experience that's in line with your vision and so on is huge. it's huge. And because truthfully, you don't know what's a detail versus what's the little thing that actually makes the whole thing work. And you can't, you're probably way too young for this, but I mean, the difference between Facebook and MySpace is the classic example of that, right? If you looked at the early versions of both of their products at the macro-ish kind of level, largely the same kind of vibe, but there were smaller details about Facebook in terms of how it worked and how they launched it and where they put it that just made it work, So you get trapped in wanting to build this beautiful thing, whereas the most important thing you can do is get it in there, get it into market and learn from what people are telling you once they have the thing, rather than telling you what they want from the thing in the future.
Yeah, it's funny. How old do you think I am?
Younger than me. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. I'm 37, by the way.
37.
I went through the MySpace and the early Facebook.
Fair enough. Okay. So, yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It's funny because there are a lot of iterations there throughout the decade where you're like, there's a change in a platform. Yeah. And then you're like, this is stupid. And then afterwards you're like, hang on, this change actually makes a lot of sense.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it makes all of the difference.
Yes.
And, for some of these organizations, in fact, for all of those kinds of organizations, they are doing a bunch of micro experiments. They're spending a lot less time postulating what might happen, and they're spending a lot more time poring over data of what people have actually done. And that's the sort of that thrifty, get it into market. And you can do that. You don't have to be Amazon or Facebook to try and adopt that kind of mindset, I suppose.
What's the best way to put that into action for a new business that don't have a lot of resources to play around with?
Yeah. I mean, one of the logic flips that I've really begun to lean into right now is when I'm looking to evaluate or decide on a particular product. The standard marketing logic says, what's the maximum addressable audience, right? And it's chase that. And now I look for opportunities with the minimum viable behavior change. And it's an inverse of logic, because now what I've realized over these years now is that actually changing people's behavior in any way, shape, or form is actually the hard part. That's really, really difficult. So if you're evaluating two opportunities, the one that is more attractive to me is the one where I think it's the easiest to change someone's behavior, or the one that I think is going to change people's behavior in the most simple and straightforward way, rather than going, there's more of these people. And that's the opposite logic to a marketing plan. To make it really concrete, it's good if you're having an idea to have a really good, well-sized market, and you definitely want a view on that future. But when you're getting into it, look for the audience whose behavior is easiest and most accessible to change. And that's a very different way of thinking about the who and the how of where you launch first, because it allows you to launch at much smaller scale. And let's face it, if you can't change the behavior of the easy ones, what chance are you going to have with everybody else? With everybody else, for tougher behavior changes, it becomes easier over time because social proof is everything. The more you can just show people doing the thing, the more people do the thing. That's why social media marketing works so well. And that's why you find yourself sucked into instant vortexes where you're suddenly about to buy something you don't need. It's all just a social proof engine, right? And unfortunately, in some cases, not very ethically deployed social proof, because they're making a lot of stuff up in a lot of cases. So when you want to go mass, social proof is what will get you there. But when you actually want to demonstrate that this thing is working at a small scale, and you want to do so authentically, it's about finding the people for whom you believe you can influence ethically. Well, that's me. Maybe that's just me. But influence ethically as effectively as possible. And that allows you to scale down who you speak to and scale down what you do and focus. Those are the things that, I even as I talk to you, I go, oh, there's things I should be doing differently tomorrow. It's this constant exercise of focusing and focusing and focusing.
It's definitely the idea of niching rather than going as broad as possible. Like, that's why I didn't just make a podcast that would go to everyone. Like I try to niche as much as possible to people that want to stay later in their career. And I'm interviewing people like yourselves who started a business later after they've had a 9 to 5.
Yeah, and that cuts both ways, right? I think hopefully it finds you a good audience, but also I think it, certainly was the reason why I said yes to this as well, was because I thought it was an interesting angle. And I love later life stories. I seek them out. So I don't know when I went from being a sort of a young achiever to a late life pivoter, but it happened sometime in the last decade. And I certainly know I look for the people who've come along and done things later in their life. And then once you start looking for them, they're everywhere. But I also don't think that there's enough of a platform given. So that's why I'm sort of super happy to support you, I guess.
Thank you. You mentioned something about stage 1, which is building the product, stage 2, hustle. Are there more stages?
Oh, yeah.
Can we go through that quickly for people that, they don't know too much about business, but they would want to have that insight from someone that's been there?
Yeah. I mean, as I said, stage 1 is to sort of establish that sort of clear guiding purpose and vision. The second is really just around shopping that vision as hard as you can. At a certain point, hopefully, then success will find you in one way, shape, or form. And then the challenges become difficult. They become more around the stuff that I enjoy, which is people, and the stuff that I hate, which is around process. So we went through with UDKU where it was around making a strategic call around what the future of our business needed to look like. We never had a view on exit. Wasn't a stage that we had planned for. And I know that that's very different to, I suppose, a lot of the startup grind of things is, what does the exit look like? I mean, I have a view on that, but it's not, there's a point before that, which is around how do I make a sustainable business in and of itself? Because if you can do that, your exit's going to be significantly more rewarding if you do. So it's really around trying to find that path to sustainability. And with UDKU, I felt quite strongly at the time there was a trend for consulting firms to be moving into the creative space. Because I'd begun my life as a management consultant, I had a view that I might be well positioned to make that transition, and I could see what that could look like. And I also felt very passionately at the time that it would help us deliver on what I thought the core vision was. And to be clear what that was, with UDKU, by the time 2013 had rolled around, I suppose the gloss of traditional advertising had begun to kind of rub off a little bit. It certainly was a frustration that all three of the partners shared, was none of us liked walking into a situation of, what's the best way of putting it, the lipstick on the pig situation, where you have you're given this brief and you look at it and you look up and you look at it and you look up and you go, there's nothing to be done here. So let's just hire a celebrity and off we go. That kind of work was really sort of beginning to lose its luster for us. It's called customer experience today. I wish we probably had as crystal language for it at the time. We called ourselves an innovation agency. But for us at the time, it was like, how do we create a business that's got its tentacles around all parts of the experience and the product? Most businesses think like that these days, but back then it was kind of odd. You had big divisions between the advertising. The people that made the ads were different to the people that stuffed the things in your letterbox, were different to the people that designed your store, were different to, everyone had a different aspect of it. And now there's a very strong sense of a customer experience being this holistic thing that needs to stick together. But at the time, we used to call it the matching luggage problem. You'd successfully integrated a campaign if the direct mailers looked like the television, which was deeply unsatisfying. So we wanted a business that was able to shape the value proposition. And I felt very strongly that some of those consulting capabilities would be very helpful in really being able to have a seat at that table of how experiences were designed. And we did a few projects that were like that, which were amazing. And it led to us being acquired. But I felt that being under a consulting banner, if you like, would actually help us deliver on the vision of it. And that was the only reason why I pushed for the exit. The fact that, it was 2018 and a year and a half later, COVID happened, and whether our little agency would have survived that remains to be seen. Hindsight made it absolutely the perfect decision. It wasn't certain at the time.
On those early days when you started UDKU, what was some of the toughest parts of those early days?
When you're trying to do something different, and that's as true now for me now as it's always been, like trying to do something different and trying to find the perfect way of expressing that difference, and then finding someone to trust you with their money to do things differently. It was definitely a challenge. We were never employed according to traditional agency relationships. We were always working through projects. There was huge uncertainty for pretty much the entire duration of that business. The sort of the occupational hazard of doing things differently was that we had to forego stability and we had to forego predictability. And that's not a comfortable place to live in over a long period of time. You do need periods of life where things are just, in a rhythm and just flowing. And I don't think we ever really, well, I certainly don't think we ever really got there. Maybe no business ever really operates that way. I'm not sure.
How did you get comfortable with all this uncertainty?
I'm sure the people who have worked with it argue that I never have. I think I've become more comfortable now. I think, honestly, it is really around a matter of how you structure your own life. And so there are, for me, the things that are sort of non-negotiable. I exercise every morning. Anyone who's ever worked with me would know that if they've caught me on a day where I haven't exercised, they know. And that was my way of making sure that I'd felt some sort of sense of personal self-care and achievement for a day. And if you can set yourself up from those kinds of habits, for me, meditation has become a part of my practice over the last 5 years. That's what worked for me. Other people will have different things that work for them, whether it is walking your dog or whether it is being home in time for dinner with your family, whatever it is, that grounding ritual that makes you feel like you have a sort of a sense of purpose. That's the key, because the rest of it you can't control. The rest of it is always just going to be chaos. But your life doesn't have to be. You always have the opportunity. I just don't believe that nobody has the opportunity to take even 30 minutes out of a day where they can do something that gives them that sense. And I don't necessarily mean it's me time. I know some of my friends who are parents, that 30 minutes is time that they absolutely lock in with their kids. Whatever it is, that anchoring point that'll make you feel like the day was well spent, whether it's exercise or quality time with family or something. Except in times of severe crisis, you can always bring those times. But I'd argue, especially in times of severe crisis, it's kind of when you need to hang on to those rituals even more. Back in the day when I could still run on my knees, they hadn't completely given out. Like, there were some fairly intense runs. I knew I was going to go into a shit fight that day, but I was fine. I think it is absolutely a choice and an acceptance that the world outside will always throw you curveballs and will be chaotic. And the other part of it is accepting that there's some days where you're just not going to deal with it that well. And there are times where I just go, okay, today's not today. Today is not the day. I'm going to give myself that time away rather than trying to always hammer through a situation that's particularly hard.
You mentioned about meditation. So there's a lot of noise out there on what kind of meditation you do. Yeah. How do you do it? If you don't mind.
No, that's fine. Actually, around about the time of the acquisition of UDKU, and I had some sort of personal upheavals that were going on at the same time. It was the perfect storm. For me, it was Vedic meditation. And for me, the simplicity of that practice and the ability to just kind of, it didn't require me connecting to an app or connecting to another human being. It was just something that I could do. I mean, I know a lot of that practice, they do group and so on, but for me, that's not worked. What I loved about it was the notion of it as a practice, and much the same as yoga or Pilates or any of these kinds of more mindful things. If you can get into a practice mindset on these things, doing it right or doing it perfectly or not the point, it's just doing it that matters. So that's what worked for me and has continued to sort of quiet my otherwise ruminating mind. I always talk about being self-employed, and when someone talks to me about it, and asking about whether it's a good idea or not. I go, however you feel about your boss now, let me tell you that you're going to hate your boss when you're self-employed, because that bastard never leaves you alone, wakes you up at 3:00 in the morning, pesters you with thoughts and ideas, and you can never get away from him because he's always with you, as opposed to the boss that you could leave at the office in the past. So for me, meditation is a way of getting my self-employed boss, aka me, off my back from time to time. So.
What was the name of the meditation again?
Vedic meditation. It's a very sort of common, common mantra-based meditation. If downloading the Calm app is what works for you, or taking the dog for the walk is what works for you, it's sort of it. I think the concept's pretty clear. It's about giving you that capsule of space.
So, just going back quickly to your time at UDKU. Looking back, what's something you'd probably approach differently now?
In terms of, there's no regrets, I think, to be really clear about it. I think I underestimated what the upheaval would be like of selling that business and remaining within that business for the period of time that we did. And I don't just mean the personal upheaval. I think for me, actually, the thing that I feel I didn't realize the extent of commitment that our people had to us and our vision and what we were doing and our independence and all of those things. I didn't really grasp it, And so I think for all of them, it was an upheaval. And I don't think I adequately foresaw or took that into account. And I've spoken to all the people that were involved subsequent to that. We're all good. But at the end of the day, I don't think I fully anticipated how difficult it would be and how much they had believed in what we created. I just don't think that I really took that into account. And so would I have done anything differently? I don't know, but I think I could have been more careful and kinder about how we'd manage that in terms of really anticipating how they would feel through it and really making sure that they would be okay in coming out the other side. So I don't think I cared. I wasn't as careful with other people as I would otherwise be now, because people do, when people come to work for you, you take on a lot. And I certainly am much more cognizant of that responsibility now.
That's a very good insight to it, because, it's your first time selling a business. So how would you know?
Exactly right. Right. And I think, the part that sort of confuses things is, of course, money is part of that, right? And there is definitely a financial incentive behind that. It absolutely wasn't the reason why I would have changed, why I sought to do it. I honestly believed it would be the thing that took us to the place where we wanted to go. And so I think a lot of pain and confusion comes in, and that people assume that that's what you're doing it for. And they respond to you accordingly, particularly if it's not what they're looking for. Wherever money has sort of become the primary motivating factor, you're just generally going to run out of road particularly quickly, because one of our greatest strengths and one of our greatest weaknesses as human beings is that we adjust very quickly. So when we are, or we are capable of quick adjustment, I should say. So this is good, because in times of crisis, if we are capable of quick adjustment, this is absolutely a strength. But when something happens, it's like a cash windfall, you adjust to that too. When we sold the business, I paid off the mortgage, and that had been my goal for so long. And then suddenly it was like, meh. And it needed to be about more than that. It has to be about more than that. And the more has become over time, the fact that, that has afforded a degree of freedom of choice around what comes next. That's an immense privilege. But also with it comes that responsibility that I needed to do something incredibly purposeful with that position. And that's what's led me to the choices of where I'm at today.
When you were running UDKU, Do you remember the first moment where you thought that this might actually work?
No. I remember it really in retrospect. I more remember a moment where I went, "Oh, right, this works." Less of a forward-looking thing, and more a matter of having achieved a particular milestone for a client, where we built a brand and a concept in a store, and it was everything that we set out to do. And I remember at the opening of that store, just looking back and going, "Yeah, oh shit, this is what we were talking about. This. So yeah, but even in that moment, it's like, then it becomes about how do you do it again and for who else? And so there's you have to go with the next one. So I don't think forever there's a sort of a moment where you go, this has worked, ta-da. It was more a matter of occasionally taking stock and looking back and going, oh, well, this is something that did work. But unfortunately, what I said to you about adjustment, okay, what's next, right? Where do we go from here? And that's
the next one.
Yeah, it's the hedonic treadmill that we're unfortunately always on, is just sort of the next achievement and the next thing.
And then related to that, was there ever a point where you felt really stretched or thought, is this all worth it?
I think in any business, you will absolutely feel that really regularly. And it's less, again, for me, I come back to, it's around this sort of sense of self-care. I'm not a very good sleeper. And
Me too.
Yeah, my sympathies, buddy. And so those moments will always combine themselves with a moment where you're just not rested enough. Because you know that if you get that miraculous 6, 7 maybe hours, you can conquer the world. You can conquer anything. I'd be lucky if I get that maybe once or twice a week. But I suppose to kind of go back and go, was there a particular moment? It's interesting. The ups and the downs of these things fade into the distance. But I've learned over time to be self-aware enough that feeling is associated with physical fatigue. And that's a really important realization to get, because, again, it ceases to be about the circumstance and more about how you are in that present moment. Am I rested? Have I done the rituals that make me feel grounded? Have I done any of those things? Because 9 times out of 10, when you're feeling that way, you haven't. And you should probably tackle whatever problem is making you feel overwhelmed when you have. And fun fact, you're generally pretty good at it the next day, or when you've done the thing that you need to do to get you grounded. I wish I could tell you there was sort of a story where I thought, it was all over. I'm absolutely certain there were hundreds of them, but I couldn't really remember them other than to say I was probably really tired. And that's what made it feel undoable, I guess.
Those things that kept you awake then, are they the same things that keeps you awake now?
I'm going to answer this in a sort of a cryptic way. It is my nature that keeps me awake, right? It is, I've learned to recognize that sort of 3 o'clock in the morning debate that I'm having, or that argument that I'm having, there'll just be a different person sitting in that chair. So no, it hasn't changed, because to that extent, I haven't fully been able to change that part of my character and that part, those habits. That's where meditation's really important to me. Is there are times where I'll get up in the middle of the night and I will just have to literally clear my head. So no, it hasn't changed, unfortunately, because that's just how my brain works. The most that I can do is be a little bit more self-aware about it. I think the biggest light bulb moment for me was one of the little sayings I have, which is, I'm never going to solve anything at 3 a.m. Like nothing. Nothing's ever going to be solved at 3 a.m. It doesn't stop my brain from trying. But if you do find yourself in that situation, that was one of the things that she says, I'm not going to solve this at 3 a.m. Like, it's not going to happen. But also going and just kind of learning to laugh at yourself and going, okay, well, here I am again. I know you've got some big changes in your own personal life and so on. And those worries are very real. But what's more real is how you manage those things rather than the specifics of them, because the specifics will change, from what it means to have young kids to teenage kids to kids you're trying to get through university. The problems shift, but how you manage with them is really the only thing you can change.
Yeah, just to share a bit, I'm pretty sure your problems are much bigger than mine, and the things that keep me awake are much smaller than yours. But what I found, what helps is that the moment that I have those thoughts, I just write them down, and then I'm like,
Very helpful.
That's externalized. I'm not going to worry about that now, and then go back to sleep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are you
It
using a
helped
pen
me.
and paper?
Yeah.
Using
No,
a pen and
I noticed that just putting it on my phone, I just have like, the to do.
Yeah,
It's like a to-do app, and then I just put it in a to-do app, because then afterwards, when I wake up in the morning, I look at my to-do app. I'm like, this is all garbage. Delete, delete,
100%.
delete.
Yeah, and the reason why I asked is because I try and keep the device out of the device as far away from the bed as possible.
Yeah.
But yes, and you see what I mean. You've got this to-do list of 1,000 things. You look at it in the morning, you're like, no, I'm not going to be doing any of those things. So nothing's going to be solved at 3 a.m. Nothing.
No, nothing. Except for diaper change for a baby.
Well, that is a problem.
The only one.
That is the one that requires solving. You see, and I don't. Yeah, as I say, I've parented nothing more than a cat or a dog in my time, so you have nothing but my admiration under those circumstances.
When KPMG first approached you, what was your initial reaction?
To be clear, they didn't approach me. I saw the trend of consulting firms and so on. I saw that they were on an acquisition path, so I definitely sought them out as the first sort of initiation. So I've only got myself to blame.
How did you do that? Like, how did you approach them to say, hey, we want to sell a business? How did you do that?
We'd been working with a couple of consulting firms. What I had suggested was finding some projects to collaborate on first. And we had worked with another consulting firm, which we'd collaborated on, and it wasn't quite a mesh. So I approached them under the auspices of, what can we do together that would make sense either from our collective client books. And they turned it into an acquisition conversation pretty quickly because we happened to fit the profile. I correctly read that, we were the kind of profile of business that they were looking for. They just bought a research agency. And I was like, I know it's going to be next, which will be a creative agency. Well, I had a hunch, and it was a good hunch.
What's something about selling businesses that people don't fully understand?
I think there's a part of due diligence, particularly in that particular process. I don't know. That it's very exposing. It's very exposing. And, it's absolutely a negotiation. And, your business is your baby, right? And you don't like people saying mean things about your baby. And part of their job is to say mean things. And it was, it was about sort of exposing where the financial risks were in the business. And so, it wasn't technically mean things. They were truthful things. But, there were things that were sort of hard to hear, I guess. It definitely wasn't a fun process. And I think, there's this sort of notion that you'll get to the point of the deal and there'll be this point of like elation and celebration. And that's certainly not how it feels at the end of the process. There's a sense of accomplishment for sure. But I think it's fair to say that I would imagine that for many people, selling a business it's a bit of an ordeal. Unlike a lot of things, when you're running your own business, lots of things are two-way doors, right? You can make the decision, and if you're not happy with that decision, you can walk back, right? You can change your mind. We had two partners in the business. Of course, we weren't in absolute lockstep. No human beings ever are. And so immense pressure was put on some very long-held working relationships and friendships and so on. It was really tough, really, really tough. And yeah, so as I say, unfortunately, it compounded with, the collapse of things in my personal life. I'm happily married now, but things were, it was speaking vulnerably, but it was a confluence of that all just sort of, went cactus at exactly the same time. And that's no real coincidence, right? Because it's an incredibly pressured time. And so unless you're kind of walking into that situation really, really well supported by friends and partners and family, it's going to be really, 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 really tough. And, I think people focus on the figure that comes out at the end and the smiling shot. And I sometimes look really closely at those smiling celebratory shots and sort of see how many of those teeth are kind of gritted like this. And you look for it. You'll see it a lot more times than you realize. A lot more, less celebration and more survival, I suppose, is more the point.
So after you sold the business, what were the days after that looking like?
Well, because we were sort of acqui-hired into the business, we were sort of bound to work within the business and hired within the business. Then it was just really a matter of trying to keep things going as best as we could. And I mentioned earlier the challenges that our people had. It wasn't just our people, it was also our clients as well. I also underestimated the extent to which they'd bought off on us they were like, good for you, but we support you as a cool, independent agency rather than. So I was that also took me off guard. I thought they'd just be happy for the greater resources available to them, and not all of them were. And then it was just really trying to panel beat our processes such as they were into the way in which they ran the business. And it's challenging, There are ways in which you run a creative team. If your creative team are keeping timesheets and they're doing so for billing purposes, they are certainly not responsible for filling those hours. The notion of creative person being at a certain level being responsible for how much they were being utilized was kind of like, well, that's my job. It's my job to make sure that they've got work to do. And yet, so there's all of those kinds of cultural shifts of that's not how we evaluate our people. And that's not how we tell them that they're doing a good job. So there were those kinds of things that were really, really, really difficult to navigate. So having to kind of be a shield from how they were trying to run the business from the top but then also them not being very happy from the bottom. You just kind of felt very stuck in the middle in terms of trying to create the best environment possible for them, but them not really. It absolutely wasn't easy. I can comfortably tell you after, 2.5 years, I was really burnt out.
So it took 2 years after you fully disengaged?
I left after 2.5 years. Yeah.
2.5.
It was toughest professionally for me just because there was a huge amount of responsibility and, if I'm really honest, guilt, I suppose, in terms of things weren't easy. And for the people around us, for the people that I'd hired. And I certainly felt a huge amount of guilt for having brought that kind of situation upon everybody. But some of them are very happy. There's some people there that are 8 years there, they're still there. So, I should probably not beat myself up too badly for all of that. But at the time, it certainly wore down on me. And I think the thing that I didn't realize then, I needed to go and get another job one more time to realize that I was really unemployable and that I needed to be in a situation where I was creating my own work and my own rhythms. When I left, I went to go and find another job because I thought that would be the ultimate sort of, back to not being in that sort of area of responsibility. But actually what I was really realizing, what I didn't realize was I'd grown used to a certain sense of being able to set the agenda and being able to control my own destiny. And for all of the uncertainty that I thought that I was giving up by moving into these structures, actually, I wanted the uncertainty back because the prize of that uncertainty was control, but it was also purpose. And I found it very difficult to find my purpose in other people's environments. I worked with some spectacular people. It wasn't about the places, and it certainly wasn't about the people. I made wonderful friends at KPMG and I made wonderful friends at the jobs that I subsequently had. But I was no longer an employee. And I finally learned that, after the second crack.
Yeah, no, I can't imagine after selling the business and then having to stay there for 2.5 years, seeing all of the result of this decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were some great things, but that's certainly what wasn't consuming my attention. And, the lesson that I should have been getting was you need to be doing your own thing. It took me one more time to go and do that before I finally got it and set myself on the path where I am now.
And so from the moment that You told KPMG that you were going to sell the business up until the point where everything was finalized. How long did that take?
I think from start to finish couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 months. It feels much longer, but logically, now that I think about it, it couldn't have been much longer than that, just in terms of the raw chronology of how long I've been on the planet. It couldn't have been longer than that. But it certainly
It did feel like
it felt
a long
forever.
time.
Absolutely. And I'm not good at keeping secrets. I like, as you've gathered, I can talk forever. And I had to keep that one secret. That was not easy. I'm the kind of person that will read to the end of a Wikipedia description of a movie because I'm just not patient that way. And I'm the same with secrets. I'm like, got to know what's happening. Keeping that kind of under my hat was bloody challenging.
And so you then went on to start BillWill.
Mm-hmm.
What did you see or experience that made you want to build again?
So I went back into working for an agency after I left KPMG. In the midst of that, what I left out of what also made working there challenging was I lost my dad in 2020 in the middle of all of this. And the day before he died, he left me enough money to go and do something bucket list. And for me, that was to go and study. I wanted to get a master's degree. I'd never got a postgraduate degree. And so I went to study behavioral science, and I was working for the agency at the same time. And so the step before BillWill was working for the agency, realizing that, as Taylor Swift would say, it's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. And see, that's as much of a millennial reference as you're going to get out of me. And so it was an Easter holiday, must have been 4 years ago. And I was lying on the beach and I had the idea of a behavioral science consultancy called Good Behavior. And the name made me laugh. And once I've named something, and I've named a few companies in my time, or once I've thought of the name of a pet or whatever, it has to happen. Like once you've named it, it's got to be there. So Good Behavior.
So you manifest it.
Yeah, exactly. Like I was like, that's a great name for a business, Good Behavior. It's hilarious. And Good Behavior still sort of operates as my sort of consulting business, if you like. But at the same time, in the process of losing my dad, I dealt with all of the administration. And my dad had worked so hard to make things as easy as possible for my mum because he was sick and we knew we had time. But even he, a lawyer, the most organized of men, with a 70-page letter of pretty much everything he could possibly think of that we might need, managed to not know that he was paying one particular bill that took us 9 months to shut. And it overwhelmed my mum, and I ended up taking it over. And it was just this ridiculously menial, small, unnecessary cruelty. And so that's where the idea for BillWill was born while I was studying and while I was then doing Good Behavior. And so BillWill, at its initiation, was an open banking enabled app that would find bills for you so you'd never lose one again. And you keep a record of them with us and you leave instructions for their closure and transfer. And when the time comes, our business does that for the family. So that's what BillWill is. It was Will for Your Bills, or was, I should say. And so I researched that as part of my master's dissertation. And that's where I did my research of 1,000 people that said, yes, of course, we want this product and pay lots of money for it. Liars, all of them. And then, wrote the dissertation, got the research results back. And the thing that I think was truthful about that in terms of the research was the reported reduction in anxiety. So the question I asked is, if you did this, how much would it lower your anticipated anxiety about what would happen after your death? And I designed the experiment for an effect size that was this big. And I got an effect size that was this big. And I was like, this could be something that is both commercial and could do some good for the world. So we still to this day, we measure a running tally of the hours of potential pain we save people. And then it became this idea that having done more market research than I'd ever done, I then had to make happen. And it just wouldn't leave me alone. And, so I was doing some consulting work under the Good Behavior banner, and that was going pretty well, but the idea just wouldn't leave me. And so we dropped the hammer on development 2 years ago, 2024, in February. And launched the first version in August of that year, which was the Bills and Bank Accounts app, which is still the core of it. And it was a total fizzer. Did not set the market alight at all. And I so realized then that I'd spent all of this time focused on my dad's one oversight, but actually the real gift that he'd given us was 70 pages of foresight. And I began to ask how many other people would have that kind of gift. And the answer to that question is not many. In fact, mostly nobody. And so we built out BillWill into being what it is today. So if bills and bank accounts are 2 modules, it's now 20 modules of little aspects of your life to consider writing down. And it considers care for your kids. What about your pets? Where are your passwords? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for every 5 minutes that you spend on the platform, we reckon you can save your loved ones about an hour of pain. So that's what BillWill is today, is this massive engine of potentially erasing people's pain. And it's a funny KPI because if we're successful, people will never know. You'll never know the hour of pain you were spared. And that's okay with me. So it's the very definition of an altruistic goal. And that really sits quite well with me. I will start using the hours that we're going to be saving people as a marketing metric because social proof, getting people to do this is actually very challenging behavior to change. But all I have to do is cast my mind back to those hours that we spent on the phone to call centers, some of them well-meaning and some of them not giving a shit. It's an invisible KPI. It's one that the person who experiences will never know that they didn't have. How many negatives have I got in there? Enough. but yeah. And I think you can see my whole demeanor changes when I talk about the product now because, we spent some time talking about some of those early businesses, but none of them, I believe, served a greater human purpose than this one does. I'm really lucky that I've got the financial freedom to kind of sit it out and wait for it to work and wait for people to kind of figure out what we're doing and wait for people to get around for it because procrastination is our number one enemy. And people will, every time people see me, they go, I need to get to that thing. And I'm like, yeah, you do. When I see people queuing up for Kylie Jenner pastries and that's really easy to sell and my product's really hard to sell, I get a little jealous. But I know that the dollars that they spend with us are going to be well spent.
I'm really sorry to hear about your dad, and thanks for sharing that. Yeah, and unfortunately, it's one of those things where you don't really know till you've been through it once, and then you'll realize how hard it really is. And then that's when you can, it's sad to say, but, now you can go like, okay, next time when this might happen, what can I do better? Because, it's really, really hard to go through someone passing away. So yeah,
sure.
Being able to help people go through that is definitely, I believe something that's only good for the world and good for people.
100%. I mean, I think the thing that I didn't quite anticipate is that it would keep me in this story. I've now, again, sort of learned to adjust to, but there was definitely a low point for me with the business where I was like, I've trapped myself into this permanent grief loop, where I'm constantly having to tell the story and to talk about it. And it softened over time, fortunately, but not always. I was on stage at a funerals conference because I go to very cool places these days. And I always start with the story and the why of why I'm in this business, because I think it's really important, particularly if you're going to be making money in the grief prevention space, that people understand your drivers and your true motivations. So you do have to put yourself out there. But yeah, there are times where literally I was on stage and, my throat catches and I can talk to you about it today and I'm fine, but different circumstance, a different day, I will feel very differently about it. There's a bit of a double-edged sword, I have to say, because, when things aren't going 100% the way that I want them to with the business, it's an incredibly powerful driver and it's an incredibly powerful resource to pull on. But it does also feel like I've sort of get myself into it, sort of a permanent point of pain. The thing that I try to do now is I suppose, pay it forward, I guess, because you attract a lot of people into your orbit whose pain is far fresher, newer, tougher on that particular day. And so there's a lot of reward in being able to be there for people and be a truly, empathetic ear under those circumstances, and really crafting what empathy is and how empathy shows up, I think is really been for me the reward of that. We do so many things meaning to be empathetic, but end up doing the opposite thing, So one of the things when I train people on grief is to be careful of things like, oh, I understand. Like, it's language that we say because we want to tell people that we relate to what they're experiencing, but actually be very triggering because you don't really understand somebody else's grief. Everyone's grief is so personal and so unique and so formed by the specifics of the good and the bad of the relationship that they lost. You really have to be really careful. It's more about creating space than demonstrating that you understand. And it's a fundamentally different skill. And there's a very simple technique around it. If you're interested, it's just to ask questions. Ask until you can tell that they don't want to talk about it anymore. And then you stop very gently. Those kinds of things, being able to flex those kinds of skills, it's really the most beautiful part of what I get to do these days.
Thank you for sharing that. So from your experience running UDKU, what are you doing differently around this time?
I think the whole world has changed, right? And even since I started the business 2 years ago versus now, I definitely in the last 2 years have learned and continue to learn what a lean mindset's about, and really about being very choiceful around where to spend time and resources. You know what I'm going to talk about now. The opportunity of what AI is actually creating within our business is extraordinary. And so for me, it's created this incredible energy because in many ways there's this incredible constraint of resources on the one side, but on the other side, there's this incredibly mineable resource that just extends what you can do with your time. So it's a really exciting time to be in the business from that perspective. And I spend a lot of time on the tools doing things that I wouldn't have done otherwise because I would have needed to have invested in a resource to do the job properly. There's a lot that I can actually do now that I'm no longer dependent on other people's skills for or other people's time for. So what I'm doing differently now is it's a bit paradoxical. It's one, being very choiceful about where I spend my money, but also having this incredible thing to play with over here that allows me to explore all sorts of things that I wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to do. This last year in particular has been this sort of explosion of potential with the business because the only limitation for it really is my imagination and where I spend my very carefully curated dollars on. There are still things that my tech team have to do, but making sure that they are focused on exactly the things that they need to do to add the most value. That's the discipline part. And then there's the wild creativity part where I play over on the right-hand side. And, as I said, my partner thinks Claude is the third wheel in our relationship. So, and he'd be right, so, I think playing this forward to advice for anyone in your area is really do try and maximize what it is that you can do yourself, because you can actually do a huge amount more than you ever could. Can you build yourself before you've invested $1 in another person or development? Because there's huge potential. What I'm doing a lot more of is what I was talking about earlier, which is just getting stuff out there. Our biggest challenge in our business is procrastination. It's one of the biggest behavioral challenges you'll ever face. I've got a whole bunch of things that I'm just trying at this point. And I think, as you consider your next life pivot, it's a really exciting time to be doing that, because the barriers to entry, not to build a business, but to prove whether your hunches are right or wrong, have really dropped. And that's a very exciting time to be out there and exploring, playing. So, there's a lot of talk about people sort of worrying about being displaced around AI and so on. And I go, if you accept that the new normal is a bunch of us operating with a bunch of small teams running outsized businesses. Be that guy, be that person, rather than waiting for the AI train to kind of run over your job.
Yeah, it's the tool. So, if you have that tool, especially if it's a tool that is really efficient, then why not try to start utilizing it and seeing if, hey, can I start my idea with this tool? And then go from there.
And it's really accessible, right? Like, this is the first piece of technology that actually invites people into it, sucks you into it, right?
Sometimes too much.
Sometimes way too much.
Yes.
Previous technologies have sort of been generational barriers. Certainly if you look at your parents and the way in which they use a phone versus the way in which you use a phone is just completely different, because the technology isn't designed for them and the way in which they see the world. It's just a very exciting time to be considering making a change in your own life. And that's one of the reasons why I agreed to do this, was to say, to the extent that it encourages anybody to do it, I think this now is the time. Because if you're sitting worried about your profession and your job, that's a really reasonable state to be. You should be. If you're not worried, you don't understand the situation. But you also need to go, okay, well, within that is this massive opportunity for you to do things.
And so also in line with that, what are you consciously not doing this time around?
I wouldn't say not, but I'm definitely less. I'm worrying less. My ego is less, in terms of the lowest point that I've had with the business, when I really went deep and I did my reflections and the things that I do in order to kind of ground myself. I realized that ego was crawling back into the equation. What if it fails, right? What if this fails? That's an ego question, because no one cares, right? Nobody cares. Well, and certainly no one cares as much as you do. Everyone around you actually wants you to succeed. And so that for me has been the thing that I'm really a lot less attached to as I do this. I want this to succeed because I know that if it or something like it succeeds, it will spare the world a lot of pain. But my ego in all of that is a much smaller component than what it used to be, which is ironic, because here I am doing a podcast, which is like, the ultimate sort of active ego, right? But underneath it all, this is a means to an end. If the story is helpful to somebody else, then great. And if someone sees it and they like it and they think it's worth engaging with the business, also great. But it's less about the clicks and the likes and the vanity metrics. It's just not a part of it anymore. I do count my LinkedIn followers, that's for sure. I'm not totally immune. I mean, come on, human, man.
Of course, yeah, you're human. Everyone is.
But yeah, I don't think it's really possible to completely divorce worry or divorce ego from it, nor should you. Like, worry is a way of alerting you to the things that you need to be attending to. And ego is a force to keep you on the path. If you can get those two things aligned, then ego is not the worst thing in the world.
What's one lesson that took you a very long time to learn, but it's a very, very important lesson?
I think patience is probably the one lesson I'm still crafting. It's like what I was talking about earlier with practice. It's patience with myself, patience with the things that I can control, patience with the things that I can't. It begins to sound a little bit like that I think it's the Alcoholics Anonymous press. But anyway, but it's the patience to deal with the things you can't control. I think there's so much hype around this, go startup culture thing, and the potential for us to always be on, become a little bit of an enemy voice in your head that you're not doing enough. And the only reason why things aren't going 100% your way right now are because you're not doing enough. And that's just impatience, really. And sometimes it is just about patience and so on. The people who recommend my product, estate lawyers, financial advisors, and so on, are incredibly busy people. And I am one of many things on their to-do list. And sometimes I will get the timing right and I'll happen to arrive in their inbox on the day that they're ready to think about it. But mostly that's not what's going to happen. And so patience is the sort of thing I'm kind of going, it will all come good in due course. to sort of bring it back to the purpose of what your conversations are really around, like, have patience enough to wait for the idea that drives your change rather than seeking the change itself, if that makes sense. Seek the idea, seek the thought that won't leave you alone, but seek it patiently. Because if you're seeking change for change's sake, you will make mistakes. If you know that there is something that's out there for you, but you can't figure out what, give it time. And I'll be honest with you, I found mine at 48. I've never been as passionate about a business as I am about the one that I'm in now. And I've never been able to therefore put myself out there as much as I've been able to. Me doing this kind of thing 10 years ago, forget it. No way. But when you have that sort of passion for which you will literally push yourself out of your comfort zone, do the things that you need to, but wait for something like that to come along. Because if you simply seek out the change before that's there, you are going to run out of road, because it's not an easy road and simply not going to have enough of a well to draw on when times get tough. So yeah, there you go. Patience. It's not the answer I thought I was going to give you, but it's the one that came to mind. So there you go.
No, I think it's good. I think it's a message that a lot of people do need to hear, especially in troubled times.
Yeah.
It's about worrying about the things that you can control rather than the things that you can't. Because the media out there is just blasting you with things that, you need to worry about this, you need to worry about this, but
absolutely
you can't control those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, to that point, one of the things that I think is really important is your digital hygiene in this space as well. I have recently taken most of the social apps off of my phone, and because frankly, the world was just becoming a very toxic and noisy place. And I will dip into them intentionally from time to time. I'm not disconnecting from them, but I will open them up. I'm probably the only person who opens up Instagram on a desktop. But it's to make sure that I'm not sucked into that vortex, and I'm just looking to see what the world is like there, and being very intentional about that, because the noise will drive you mad at this point, particularly now.
Yeah, and if it's something that you really need to worry about, it will reach you.
Absolutely.
It will.
Absolutely. If it's that important, someone will send me a text. So
exactly. What advice would you give someone earlier in their journey?
To kind of cycle it back to the newsletter story, which is, again, not one I expected to dig out, but you take us into some interesting spaces. There are always opportunities in life to go above and beyond for other people, whether that's your friendships or whether that's in work. I think for me, to try and constantly seek opportunities to be authentically of service and of help and of care for others lays a platform for a very both happy and loving, but also productive life, because I'm constantly surprised by the things that I did, that people come back to me and say, I've never forgotten the time you did that for me. Like, I think if you just adopt a mindset of everybody around you, we're all looking for a degree of validation and help and care. And there are opportunities to go above and beyond your job description, go above and beyond your role as a spouse or a parent, above and beyond your role as a friend. And all of those things lay the platform for a very loving life, but also, if you want to be really Machiavellian about it, also a very productive one, because people remember who was good to them and will be far more helpful to you in return in the future. So, that will stand you in good stead, regardless of when it is that you finally decide to pull whatever your next big move is together. Because what you'll find is that when you do that, you will have a ready-made raft of cheerleaders that you just didn't expect. And it's really a wonderful thing. And that's the part of life I'm enjoying the most at the moment.
And do you think starting a business later in life actually gave you an advantage?
There are definitely things that are helpful having done this now, for sure. That network, that confidence, the certain less fucks given, those all help without question. Do I miss the level of 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning energy that I was able to pound out at the gym and then do a full 18-hour day. Yeah, I miss that. I definitely would have loved to have been doing some of that when I had a lot of that energy. And, I'm pretty energetic and I work pretty long hours, but yeah, I definitely had more energy and I wish I had a little bit more of that still. I probably do better than I give myself credit for in that area, but that's the only part of it. I'm a little bit different to the extent that some people are much more sort of confident in their ignorance and their youth. For me, confidence has come with age, and that's been a big advantage. But for other people, ignorance is confidence, and that's great. And I've always envied those people. I was just not one of them. For me, it took me a long time.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah. But for me, that came with a lot of sort of uncertainty and insecurity, and those things kind of ruled my life a lot more than they do now. So yes, for me, the answer is yes, but that's because it's really taken me a long time to be quietly, I say this quietly, I'm on a podcast talk about it, but quietly confident in the things that I believe I can contribute to the world.
Was there anything you want to talk about that we haven't yet touched on?
No, you've gone pretty deep. I don't think I've ever spent. This is probably, other than paying someone $350 an hour, I don't think I've ever spoken about myself this much ever. So it feels
sort
a very
like a mini therapy, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, we certainly. I hope was there. Yeah, not from my end. Thank you. It's been a very reflective chat for me. I hope it's interesting to you. That's all.
No, I'm pretty sure it's interesting to the viewers, as it was for me as well.
Yeah,
because I get to reflect about people that have had a business, looking after people, employees. But hearing all of this from you also solidifies a lot of the things that I'm thinking, that I'm assuming at this stage.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that I'm just assuming. I don't know. I've never been there. I've never been in your position yet. But it gives me a lot of confidence hearing a lot of the things that you say, the things that you talk about, adding value to the world rather than sucking up value.
Awesome. No, I think I
really appreciate it.
I look forward to seeing where these adventures take you.
Yes, me too. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. My pleasure.